The morning Audrey called security on the wrong person, she had no idea she was about to unravel everything she thought she'd built. It started the way most Tuesday mornings at Carver and Webb did. Gray sky pressing low over downtown Vancouver, the kind of damp cold that gets into your collar before you've even reached the lobby doors. Audrey Sinclair arrived at 7:43, heels clicking across the marble floor, a coffee cup in one hand and her phone in the other. She had a board presentation at 9, a call with the Tokyo office at 11, and absolutely no patience for anything that fell outside that schedule. She noticed him the moment she stepped off the elevator. He was sitting in the reception area on the 4th floor, the executive floor, in one of those low cream chairs that the interior designer had chosen specifically because they looked uncomfortable. He was wearing a dark wool jacket, the kind that had been good quality once but had seen too many winters. A canvas bag sat at his feet. Beside him, cross-legged on the chair, a girl of about 7 was drawing something in a small notebook, her tongue pressed to her lower lip in concentration. Audrey slowed. The 4th floor wasn't open to walk-ins. You needed a keycard to get past the lobby desk downstairs and a separate one for the elevators. She glanced at Jenna, the floor receptionist, who gave a small, helpless shrug that said, "I tried." "Good morning," Audrey said, keeping her voice even. "Can I help you?" The man looked up. He had an unremarkable face, not unpleasant, just quiet, the kind of face that didn't announce itself. He was maybe 40, with dark circles that suggested either a long drive or a very young child, and he seemed entirely unbothered by the fact that he was sitting on the executive floor of a company worth $300 million, with a child drawing rabbits beside him. "I'm here to see the board," he said. "I have an appointment. Well, I requested one, about 6 weeks ago. Your name, Nathan Webb." Audrey went very still. Behind her, she heard Jenna shift in her chair. "Mr. Webb," she said carefully. "Nathan Webb passed away 4 years ago." The man looked at her with something that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite irritation. "I get that a lot," he said. "Turns out rumors of my death were exaggerated." The little girl beside him didn't look up from her notebook. "That's from Mark Twain, Daddy," she said, except he said greatly. "You're right, Bug," he said. "She's right," he added to Audrey. Audrey had been CEO of Carver and Webb for 3 years. She had not taken the job expecting it to be easy. The company was a mid-sized infrastructure consulting firm with offices in Vancouver, Calgary, and Halifax, founded in 2003 by 2 engineers, Douglas Carver and Nathan Webb, who had apparently been university roommates with a shared passion for building things that actually worked. Douglas had died of a heart attack in 2019. Nathan had disappeared. That was the word people used, disappeared. 6 months later, under circumstances that the remaining board had never fully explained to Audrey's satisfaction. When she had asked during her hiring process, she'd been told, "Nathan had some personal difficulties. He stepped away. We haven't been able to reach him. For all intents and purposes, the company is yours to run." She had accepted that. She had run the company well. Revenue was up 18% over 3 years. They'd won 2 major provincial contracts. She had restructured the internal teams, cut what needed cutting, invested where it mattered. She had not, in 3 years, once considered that Nathan Webb might walk back through the front door with a 7-year-old and a canvas bag. She put him in the small boardroom. Not the main one. The main one was being set up for her 9 o'clock, but the secondary room off the hallway, with the round table and the window that looked onto the parkade. She asked Jenna to get him a coffee and something for the child, and then she called Louis Pemberton, the board chair, from the hallway. "He's here," she said. A pause. "Who's here?" "Nathan Webb." The pause stretched longer this time. "That's not possible. He's in the secondary boardroom right now, Louis. His daughter is drawing in a notebook." He knew about the Mark Twain quote, "Audrey, I'm going to need you here in 20 minutes. And I'm going to need you to tell me." She kept her voice low and steady. "What exactly you knew and when you knew it." She ended the call before he could answer. She went back to the boardroom. The little girl had finished her rabbit and was now drawing what appeared to be a building. A tall one, with many windows. Nathan was looking out at the parkade with his hands wrapped around a coffee mug that Jenna had clearly found somewhere because it had the company logo on it, the old logo, the one they'd retired 2 years ago. "Your daughter," Audrey said, pulling out a chair across from him. "What's her name?" "Marin," he said. "She's 7. She goes everywhere with me at the moment. Her mom's in the hospital." He said it flatly, without self-pity, the way people do when they've been saying something so many times it's lost its weight. Nothing critical. But it's been a few months, and Marin's had enough of other people's houses. Audrey looked at the girl. Marin had her father's quiet quality, that same self-containment, like she'd learned early that the world didn't stop for her feelings and had decided to just keep drawing. "I'm sorry," Audrey said. And she was, genuinely, but she was also the CEO of a company this man may have had a legal claim to, and she needed to understand what was happening before Lewis arrived and started managing the situation. "Can you tell me why you're here?" Nathan set down the mug. "I own 51% of this company," he said. "I always have. I signed documents in 2020 that transferred operational control to the board on a temporary basis while I dealt with some personal matters. Those documents had an expiration clause, 5 years, or until I gave written notice of return, whichever came first." He looked at her. "I gave written notice 6 weeks ago. I sent it registered mail to Lewis Pemberton and to the company's legal address. I got a read receipt confirmation and then nothing. No response, no acknowledgement. So here I am." Audrey said nothing. She was turning it over in her mind, the shape of it, the implications, and she felt something cold and clarifying settle in her chest. Not panic, just the particular alertness of someone who realizes they may have been kept deliberately in the dark. "Did you know?" he asked. Not accusatory, just asking. "No," she said. He studied her for a moment. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she repeated. "I believe you." He shrugged slightly. "You've got the face of someone doing mental arithmetic about what Lewis has been hiding, not the face of someone who knew." Audrey wasn't sure whether to be insulted or not. She decided not. Lewis Pemberton arrived at 8:22 with 2 other board members, Gerald Fitch and a woman named Constance Park, whom Audrey had always found slightly impenetrable, and a lawyer she didn't recognize. The lawyer was carrying a leather briefcase and looking at Nathan the way lawyers look at problems they'd hoped wouldn't materialize. Lewis was 63, silver-haired, the kind of man who'd spent 40 years being the most important person in every room he entered. He walked into the secondary boardroom and stopped when he saw Nathan, and for just a moment, a fraction of a second, something crossed his face that Audrey filed away carefully. It wasn't surprise. "Nathan," Lewis said, recovering. I have to say, this is unexpected. I sent registered mail," Nathan said. "I have the receipt. We received your letter, yes, and the email, and the follow-up email, and the call to your assistant on March 14th. Lewis spread his hands. There were questions about the validity of the transfer documents. We felt it prudent to consult legal counsel before responding. For 6 weeks, these things take time." Nathan looked at him for a long moment and then said very quietly, "You thought I wasn't going to show up." Nobody answered that. Marin, from the corner where she'd moved to continue drawing on the windowsill, said without looking up, "The rabbit's name is Clover, apparently to no one in particular." Audrey had her 9 o'clock canceled. She sat in the main boardroom while Lewis and the board's lawyer went over the documents Nathan had brought, and he had brought documents, organized and flagged, and clearly prepared by someone who knew what they were doing, and she kept returning to one specific thing Lewis had said 6 weeks into her tenure, 3 years ago. "For all intents and purposes, the company is yours to run. Not the company is yours. Not Nathan Webb has signed over control permanently. For all intents and purposes," a phrase she'd taken as bureaucratic shorthand for a clean transition. A phrase that meant she now understood exactly what it said and nothing more. The lawyer, Nathan's lawyer, who had arrived by 11, a sharp-faced woman named Renata, who clearly billed $400 an hour and enjoyed every minute of it, laid out the timeline calmly. Nathan had transferred operational control in March 2020 for personal reasons related to a family health crisis. The transfer documents were clear, legal, and time-limited. The board had received his notice of return in February of this year. They had not responded. They had not, as far as anyone could tell, taken any steps to prepare for his return or inform Audrey of the situation. Gerald Fitch said, around 1 in the afternoon, that he thought the documents were ambiguous. Renata looked at him the way a surgeon looks at a patient who is self-diagnosed using social media. "They're not ambiguous, Mr. Fitch," she said. "The clause is written in plain language. There were concerns," Lewis said, "about whether Nathan was in a position to Audrey said. Everyone looked at her. She hadn't spoken in almost 2 hours. "To return," Lewis said carefully. "Given the circumstances." "What circumstances?" She was looking at Lewis directly now. "Because, from where I'm sitting, it looks like a man with 51% ownership of this company sent you registered mail 6 weeks ago, and you decided not to tell me. I'd like to understand what circumstances justify that." Lewis looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has spent decades being certain that things would work out in his favor. "Audrey, you've done exceptional work here. The board's position was that continuity. The board's position," she said, "isn't going to hold up in court." The afternoon was long. Renata and the board's lawyer disappeared into the small boardroom with the documents. Lewis tried twice to get Nathan alone. Nathan declined politely both times. Gerald Fitch left at 2:30, citing another commitment. Constance Park stayed, said very little, and at one point brought Marin a sandwich from the kitchen without being asked. Audrey spent most of the afternoon in her own office, reading. She pulled every document she'd been given during her hiring process, every board minute, every financial summary from the past 3 years. She was looking for what she'd missed, not to defend herself, but to understand the shape of what had been built around her without her knowledge. It was, she realized, quite an elegant structure if you thought of it coldly. Lewis had known Nathan might return. Lewis had built a company that looked clean and profitable from the outside, but had, in the last 18 months, quietly begun redirecting resources away from the infrastructure divisions Nathan had cared about, the community-focused projects, the northern remote contracts that didn't pay as well, but served populations that didn't have other options. Money had moved toward higher-margin urban contracts. A particular consulting subsidiary had been spun off in a structure that benefited certain board members directly. None of it was quite illegal. All of it was exactly what Nathan would have objected to. She thought about the first year she'd been here, when she'd pushed to expand the Northern Division, and Lewis had talked her out of it. Not the right time, Audrey. The margins just aren't there. She'd deferred to his experience. She'd believed he was looking out for the company. She went to find Nathan. He was in the small boardroom again, Marin asleep, on 2 chairs pushed together, her jacket folded under her head. Nathan was at the table with a cup of tea going cold beside him, reading something on his phone. He looked up when Audrey knocked on the open door. "Can I come in?" "It's your boardroom," he said. "It's actually yours," she said. "Or it might be, depending on how this afternoon ends." "Can I sit down?" He gestured to a chair. She sat. She'd taken off her blazer somewhere around 2 o'clock and hadn't put it back on, and she thought absurdly that this was probably the least corporate she'd looked in 3 years in this building. "I've been going through the financials," she said. "And Lewis has been using this company as a vehicle," she said. "Not obviously, not illegally probably, but deliberately and in ways that go against what Carver and Webb was built to do." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Douglas always said that would happen if I ever stepped away too long." He looked at his hands. "He knew Lewis better than I did. Why did you trust him?" "I didn't have a lot of options in 2020, Nathan said. "My daughter, not Marin, my older daughter, she's 22 now. She was very sick. I needed to be home. I needed someone to run things, and Lewis was the obvious choice. He'd been on the board for 12 years. He looked up. "I thought 5 years was long enough to be too long. I thought he'd want me back." "He didn't want you back," Audrey said. "He was hoping the 5 years would expire quietly, and he'd be able to argue the clause had lapsed. I know. He's going to fight this. I know that too." Nathan glanced at Marin, who had turned over in her sleep, pulling her jacket tighter. "I came prepared to fight it. But I also want you to know, I've seen what you've done here. Revenue's up. The Halifax office is running better than it ever did. The staff retention numbers have improved." He looked back at her. "I'm not here to undo your work. I'm here to get my company back and make sure it stays what it was meant to be." Audrey looked at him for a long moment. "What was it meant to be?" "Useful," he said simply, "to the people who actually need it." The next few weeks were not quiet. Lewis contested the return clause through the board's legal team, arguing procedural grounds that Renata dismantled methodically and without evident satisfaction. She was the kind of lawyer who found satisfaction unnecessary. The board held an emergency meeting that Audrey attended, and Nathan technically had the right to chair, which he did with a composure that clearly unnerved Lewis considerably. Gerald Fitch resigned. Constance Park did not, and voted with Nathan on the 2 motions that mattered most. There was a story, not a scandal exactly, but a story, that a financial journalist in Calgary started piecing together about the consulting subsidiary and the board members' interests. Nathan didn't encourage it. He also didn't discourage it. Marin's mother came home from the hospital on a Thursday in early April, which meant Marin went back to school the following week. Nathan mentioned it briefly in the hallway outside his again now office, with the particular lightness of someone who's been holding their breath for months and has finally been allowed to exhale. "That's good news," Audrey said. "I'm glad, thank you," he said. "And then I told her about you, my wife. She said you sounded like someone worth keeping." Audrey wasn't sure for a moment what to do with that. "Keeping for what?" "I've been thinking about the CEO position," he said. "I own 51% of this company. I have no interest in running it day to day. That was never what I did well, and I haven't done it in 4 years. You've done it well." He was matter-of-fact about it, not flattering. "I'd want to restructure the mandate, bring the Northern Division back, change the subsidiary arrangement. And I'd want actual oversight, real reporting, not the kind Lewis thought he was getting away with." Audrey thought about the 18 months she'd spent deferring to Lewis Pemberton. She thought about the conversation she'd never had, the questions she'd never asked, the due diligence she'd assumed had been done before she arrived. "I'd want my own legal counsel reviewing the board structure," she said. "Reasonable. And I'd want the Northern Division mandate in writing, not as a suggestion. As a condition of the company's operating framework, also reasonable. And I want to know," she said, "when things are wrong. I don't want to be the last person in the building to find out that the man who owns the place is sitting in the lobby." Nathan smiled at that. Not a big smile, just a brief one. "I didn't intend to sit in the lobby. I had an appointment. Well, I requested one, about 6 weeks ago." "I know," she said. "I know you did, and that's on me, too. I should have been asking more questions long before you walked through that door." She said it cleanly without performing the contrition. Because it was true, and she knew it, and there was no point in dressing it up. She had been given the company, and she had run it well by most measures, and she had not looked closely enough at the parts that didn't add up, because looking closely was uncomfortable, and Lewis had always had a good answer. That was on her. "I'm told you pushed to expand the Northern Division in your first year," Nathan said. She looked at him. "Lewis talked me out of it." "I know. Constance told me." He paused. "I think that means your instincts were good from the beginning. The thing about rebuilding trust, real trust, not the kind that comes from not being caught, is that it's slow." Audrey knew that. She'd spent her career understanding organizational dynamics, which meant she also understood that the damage Lewis Pemberton had done wasn't just financial or structural. It was cultural. There were people at Carver and Webb who had watched the company drift and had said nothing, because saying something didn't seem worth the risk. There were people in the northern communities who'd held contracts and then lost them and had quietly adjusted their expectations of what a company like this would actually deliver. That took time to repair. It took showing up consistently and doing the less glamorous thing when the more glamorous option was available. Audrey was good at that. She'd always been better at consistency than at spectacle. The Northern Division came back slowly. A contract in northern British Columbia in June. A partnership with a First Nations-led infrastructure organization in September that Nathan had been in conversation with for years before 2020 and that Audrey rebuilt carefully, meeting by meeting. The Halifax office, already running well, took on 2 community infrastructure projects that didn't have great margins and mattered enormously. Lewis Pemberton did not sue. He sent a letter through his lawyer in July that was long and full of language about his contributions to the company over 12 years, which were real and which did not balance against what he'd done. Nathan wrote a response that was 4 sentences long and copied Renata. In November, on a morning that had the same gray Vancouver damp as the morning Nathan had walked in with Marin and her notebook, Audrey was in her office when she got a text from an unknown number that turned out to be Marin. Apparently, she had negotiated her own phone. "My dad says you're keeping the company. I think that's good. Clover agrees." Audrey sat with that for a moment. Then she texted back, "Tell Clover I appreciate the vote of confidence." A response came back almost immediately. "Clover says you're welcome, but you should get a plant for your office. It would make it less serious." Audrey looked around her office. It was, she had to admit, fairly serious. Clean lines, the old company logo on one wall that she'd been meaning to update, a window with a view of the mountains on clear days. Functional. Serious. She got a plant the following week. A small fern that she put on the windowsill, where it caught the thin winter light. It wasn't a transformation. It was just a fern. But she found unexpectedly that she liked the way it looked there. Something living in a room she'd always kept very controlled, taking up a small amount of space and not apologizing for it. She thought Nathan would appreciate the symbolism. She thought Douglas Carver, whoever he'd been, probably would too. The company was not fixed. That wasn't how it worked. Nothing was ever fully fixed. Not companies, not trust, not the slow work of building something that actually served the people it was supposed to serve. But it was more honest than it had been. And it was pointed in the right direction. That, Audrey had learned, was usually the most you could say on any given morning. And most mornings, it was enough.